So I will start off just by giving you a little bit of background about myself. So I am an instructional designer. I also am an e-learning accessibility consultant. I've been in L&D for all of my career now, which is quite a long time now. And my last job was at the University of Southampton in the UK, and I was lucky enough while I was there to focus on e-learning accessibility and looking specifically at how to make e-learning created using authoring tools accessible. While I was there, I realised that there was very little support really for content authors or people working in e-learning to do that, to make their e-learning accessible, which is what prompted me to start my company. So my company is eLearning, which stands for e-learning accessibility. So what I'm going to cover today, if I just move to the next slide. So we are going to start off by looking at the digital accessibility legal landscape, one of the things that Catherine said would be interesting for the global community. Then we're going to move on to look in more detail at the standards, which are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So you can see there the shortened term is WCAG. So I'll be saying WCAG, which is how I tend to pronounce it quite a lot this afternoon. Then we'll be looking at one of the things that we've been discussing quite a lot is this idea that accessible e-learning, whether it can be as good as, or if not better, learning for everybody, or this perception that maybe people think it's not, it can't be interactive and it tends to be boring. So we'll be looking at hopefully seeing if we can see some ideas that might challenge that. One of the things that I was asked to look at was keyboard accessibility in quiz slide. So we'll be focusing on some examples of that and show how we can do that in an accessible and hopefully interesting way. The other thing I was asked to look at was accessible VR, so we'll be touching on that as well. Generally, I normally finish a webinar just by looking at some more benefits of accessibility. So hopefully having engaged you and got you excited and interested in accessibility, just looking at some disability facts and figures and some advantages and benefits for businesses and for people to actually take the time to invest in accessibility. And then we have got a session at the end for questions. Obviously, if you have a question as we're going along, if you want to stop me and ask me anything at any point, I think that would work well. Otherwise, if you want to just, I don't know, put something in the chat or jot something down and we can have a discussion at the end, I think that would be really helpful.
Sounds good.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Lovely.
Yeah,
okay. Good. Lovely. And just one thing, we are recording the session. So if you, anybody who isn't able to come, will obviously can send them a recording. And also, I think, Tony, I've already sent you some notes, haven't I? The notes and the links. Yes. So all the information that you'll see on the slides, I can send to you afterwards, after the session. So don't worry about getting the links. Okay, so everyone, awesome. Good to go? Right, okay, we'll make a start. So digital accessibility legal landscape, one of the things that I was asked to look at. So there are two sites, and again, the links of these will be in the notes that I send you. One is the WAI, the Web Accessibility Initiative, and that is produced by W3C. Those are the same people that produce the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So that's really a good overview of international web accessibility laws, and it has quite a useful table with links to various countries, and it also has links to the legislation themselves. So if you want to find out a bit more about the international the laws in your country, it's a good starting point. Another one is, the other link on there is the Dino Mapper site, which is very similar, but it's a little bit more in depth, and it also is a bit more up to date. So yes, if you're looking for information about the laws in your own country, those both are a very good starting point. So it's not possible really to say that there is one unfortunately, international overarching accessibility law that will help us to know exactly what we want to do. There are a couple of trends which we'll be looking at. One of them is that the legislation tends to be stronger in most countries in the public sector and in government, which I think you would probably expect. And the other trend is really a move towards the using WCAG as the legal standard in a lot of countries. So we'll just look at some examples now of the various different countries I think involved in this community. And I won't go through these in detail. Obviously, these I found this information on the sites that I've given you. Occasionally, those sites don't document all countries, so sometimes it's simply a matter of looking on an internet search, and that's exactly what I've done to find this information. I hope it's the most up-to-date information, but I'm not a legal expert, so I think it's just really a flavour of some of the different legislation that's there universally. Some of the information here is interesting in that it shows that first trend that I said. So the fact that the legislation tends to be more stringent in government and in public sector. So you can see that in India's policies and guidelines. Also in America, you have the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that's the kind of general disability discrimination overarching act. And then you have Section 508. A lot of people have heard of Section 508, mainly because a lot of the software is created in the US, and if you are a federally funded organisation, you need to meet the Section 508 regulations. So a lot of software will actually tell you how they meet Section 508. You also have here at the bottom the EU directive on the accessibility of websites and mobile applications of public sector bodies. So that directive is one that we'll focus a little bit more on because it's quite a new directive. So that came out in 2016. But the interesting thing about that is that has now been passed into the legislation of all EU member states. And although the way that law is, the way it's monitored and the way that it's basically enforced, there is some autonomy in different EU countries on how that's done. The legal side of it tends to be very similar. So I'll just focus on the UK laws, really, just to show you what's happening with that law and why it's important. So in the UK, the overarching sort of disability discrimination act that we have is called the Equality Act. And the interesting thing about that act is that we have actually, since that act was passed in 2010, had an obligation, which is what we call an anticipatory duty, to provide people with disabilities with what they call reasonable adjustments. So every organisation really has, and you can see in that quote that I have there, they shouldn't have to wait until a disabled person wants to use their services, but must think in advance about what disabled people with a range of impairments might reasonably need. So actually, legally, all websites and all e-learning in the UK should be accessible. That's been very difficult to prove and to get people to make any claims against anything that's inaccessible, which we will talk about later. So the public sector bodies regulation is what that EU directive has turned into in the UK. So in all EU member states, they will have an equivalent of that law. And interestingly, from the UK point of view, that law isn't going anywhere. It doesn't depend on what the outcome of Brexit. That is in the UK law. So I think this law is very significant from the EU point of things. The fact that it's actually, it's for the first time really, I think, clearly saying that there is a standard that you need to meet to make things accessible if you're working in the public sector. The thinking is eventually it will spread everywhere, but I'm not sure how long that will take. So if we look in a bit more detail at what that law says in the UK, a couple of things just to be aware of, really. I won't go through all this in detail. Obviously, you've got the details in the notes that I'll send you if you're interested. But a couple of things to be aware of, particularly in the UK, is that the UK, the public sectors does include further and higher education. I think there was some debate about that at the beginning, but that's definitely involved. They are definitely public sectors. You can see there are some exclusions. So some, for example, charities, schools and nurseries aren't they don't have to comply. Content included not only all websites, but all intranets, extranets, including VLEs and LMSs, and any content held on that. So that includes all e-learning resources, Word documents, PDFs, etc. And also in the future, mobile applications. So Tony, what you were discussing a little bit earlier. If you look at mobile applications, interestingly, from a compliance point of view, you can see if you looked further down at that graphic, you can see the compliance deadline for mobile applications is actually the June the 23rd in 2021. So there's a bit longer for making mobile applications accessible in the public sector. From the point of view of everything else, the deadlines to be aware of, for most things, it's next September for new content on the majority of websites. If you have a website that's been created after the 23rd of September last year, you're actually looking at a very tight deadline for all content on that website to be accessible if it's externally facing. So generally, for most people, we will say that you're looking at the deadline of 2020 in September. Any questions about that? Or
no, not from me. Thank you.
Not from me.
No, right, I'll carry on going then.
Clear, very clear.
Good. Okay, so threat of litigation. So it really interestingly that it is the legal side of things that often bring people into to be interested in e-learning accessibility. So from the point of view of legislation and the threat of litigation, particularly, or just starting in the UK, as I said, although we have the Equality Act, this idea that we had reasonable adjustments in the past, it made it very difficult for people to prove whether a company was breaking the law because the definition of reasonable adjustment wasn't that clear. I think a lot of people think that the new public sector regulations are a game changer because they, for the first time, say if you don't meet the regulations, and those regulations are WCAG. So it's basically WCAG, it's the 50A and AA guidelines that you need to be meeting in your eLearn and in your website. And that is the clear regulation that you have to meet. So it's much easier now for people to prove if organisations aren't meeting the regulations. So you don't have that kind of, the maybe not so clear on what a reasonable adjustment was that we had in the UK in the past. Another interesting point about the threat of litigation is if looking at the States, which is a really interesting case. So this, in the States, I'm not saying this is going to happen everywhere, but it is something to be aware of, that it's a huge amount of, a huge increase in the amount of cases of web accessibility related lawsuits. So you can see in the infographic here that in 2018, they had an increase of 181%. And that was 2,258 cases in the US against inaccessible websites. Interestingly, 11% of those companies sued were headquartered internationally. So I wouldn't say it's a trend that's definitely going to spread, internationally, but it is something that I think is definitely worth being aware of. That this threat of litigation is, I think, becoming more real to a lot of companies. Okay, so the other thing that we said about international web accessibility laws, the second thing was that focusing on web content accessibility guidelines. So the standards now are kind of coming in line. So for a long time, some countries have always used the web content accessibility guidelines. A good example is in the States, that Section 508 law has only recently come in line with WCAG. Before that, it was a variation, but now it's very clearly WCAG. The variation that they use in the States is actually version 2.0, whereas the one for the EU directive and any related law is the most up-to-date version, which is 2.1. So, and that came in June last year. So there are still variations, but I think there's definitely a trend towards the web content accessibility guidelines being the kind of definitive standard of what e-learning and what web content accessibility actually means for everybody. So if we look in a bit more detail about WCAG, and Katrin, I know you've said you've had a look at some of the guidelines, so I'll just give you an overview really of what you need to know if WCAG is completely new to you. So as we said, they are produced by the Web Accessibility Initiative, part of W3C. They are the most now comprehensive and widely used international digital accessibility standards. They're also used for audits, which is quite interesting because they're designed to be pass or fail standards. So it should be very easy, again, coming back to this idea of litigation, to prove if someone has passed or failed these standards. So most legal compliance specifies up to level AA. Sorry, I missed one there. There are 3 levels of criteria: A, AA, and AAA. Mostly it's up to level A, which means A and AA. So from the new regulations in the UK and in Europe, that means there are 50 criteria that you need to meet. Some of them are very much based on coding. So there are a few that aren't applicable to an authoring tool that doesn't allow you to go into the back end and change the coding. But there are probably, I'd say, about 40 that you need to be aware of if your tool doesn't allow you to go and change the coding. Katrin, have you had any experience of looking at those, of the actual guidelines?
A little bit.
Okay.
But I think I mean, some of them are fairly easy to understand, I guess.
Yeah.
But some I struggled a little bit.
Okay.
Just in general, to know how to actually implement that into the design parts as well.
Okay, and so were you basically going just on the guidelines, or had you been given some help by your company to do them, or?
Well, so we've done a bit of an overview of them in general.
Okay.
And what to look out for, if that makes sense. But I don't think we actually went through the actual guidelines.
Okay, so
you haven't found them on your website. Yeah.
Okay, so you haven't had a checklist or anything that you're working off.
A little bit we do.
Okay.
I don't know how much they then relate to the guidelines, if that makes sense. There's a checklist we work on. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. I think that's quite standard in lots of examples, in lots of cases. Yeah. Okay, great.
I think what they've done is just to translate the guidelines into that checklist to make it a bit easier for us to work on it.
Yeah, definitely. So if you haven't had any experience, Tony, you said they would be new for you, the WCAG regulations. Are you there, Tony?
Oh, I think she's on mute.
Yes. No, I'm
sorry, it's my fault.
I was chatting, but I forgot to take the mute off. Sorry.
No worries.
Chatting away. No, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So they would be new for you. Okay. So the way that the WCAG are divided into is these 4 principles. So, and again, Katrin, you may have heard of these ideas of perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And that is how those regulations are divided. If you haven't seen them, I'll just give you a screenshot of what they look like. So you can see all of those different standards that you need to be meeting there.
Wow.
In my own opinion, the way that they're divided isn't particularly helpful. I don't find it's supposed to be an easy thing to remember that, it's poor. I don't find it very easy to apply those principles. So perceivable, for example, are all the guidelines which tell you that you should be able to perceive the content of your app or of your e-learning output with any of your senses. So, for example, that's the kind of guidelines that you need to put captions for audio or for video content, and also for if you need to put the fact that you need to put alternative text on images, so that any sense you can actually perceive the information. Operable is where you can actually use that using any kind of so you can operate it in any way. So, for example, a good example you can see at the top there is keyboard accessible, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Understandable, yes, it has to be clear. You have to be able to understand it and understand how to use it, but you also have to make it understandable with assistive technology. So, for example, you need to be able to set the language so that the screen reader knows which language to read out, for example. And robust is generally the coding in the background. So there's only a few there you can see. So for me, as an e-learning instructional designer, it's not very easy to understand them or to apply them in that particular, having them structured like that. So just an idea of some things that you can do. I'll just skip that one since you've had. Yes, so this is a picture of how it seemed. I found this on the internet. I don't actually think it's a proper IKEA instruction. I think it's just someone who's made it up. But for me, it really summed up how difficult it was to be able to apply those concepts to e-learning. It's just like they just seem so, almost not really related to what I was trying to do. And so the way that I tend to do it is I either divide them up into thinking about the different types of impairments. So, for example, visual, hearing, motor, and cognitive, and looking at it from that point of view, for me, that just makes it a little bit more real, a bit more understandable. And what I tend to do now in my training is I've actually come up with a framework where I've divided them into, instead of those 4 groups, I've divided them into 8 groups. And that follows the process, I think, of developing a piece of e-learning. So it's, you could start off with your the setup and the design, and then move to navigation, then to the text. And then move through the publishing, etc. So it just makes it a little bit easier to apply. So I think the web content accessibility guidelines are very, very useful. I think it's just finding a way that you can make them a bit more, make it just a bit more effective and more real to what you're actually trying to do to apply to e-learning, for example.
I think that's how I felt when I looked at them. I didn't really read through them, I have to be honest. But yeah, it was very difficult to actually understand how they relate. So yeah, what you have on your website is really helpful.
Oh, good.
Because that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? You have the different disabilities, and that's how you work. Or what you work towards, really. Yeah.
I think the different types of disabilities is a good introduction, because I think it just makes you think of, well, I think the difficulty is it just seems to be quite abstract. But if you think of the different disabilities, it's a really good starting point to think, well, the reason I'm doing this is because it can help this impairment. I think once you've got that kind of, maybe the kind of understanding, the basic understanding, then moving on. And I'm not saying that my framework is the only framework that you can apply. I just think it's, if you can come up maybe with your own way of applying that at logical points of the process, it just makes it a lot easier than having the great long list, as I say, divided up into those. You just think, well, I've now got to check this 48-point list.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've actually applied them in the right order, you think, well, okay, now I'm looking at everything I need to know about text. Now I'm looking at everything I need to know about media. It just makes it a little bit easier to do, I think. Definitely, yeah. Okay, lovely. So we'll move on to the next section, which is just looking at some ideas really to challenge this perception that accessible e-learning is inferior to non-accessible e-learning. So this idea that it has to be boring and it can't be interactive. So we'll look in detail at some examples in a minute, but I just want to start off by looking at something that I do as well on training, is to ask people to think, rather than just about the permanent disability, and we've already looked at the 4 different categories that you could have for a permanent disability, to think about temporary and situational impairments that can affect anyone at any time. So, for example, one for vision is that someone could have eye laser surgery, and then it's difficult for them to look at the screen, for example, the brightness of the screen. Or from a mobility point of view, so mobility, you're looking at people who are not able to use a mouse. So something like RSI, something that people quite often, they might not have it all the time, but it can be temporary, and it can be debilitating to the point that they can't use the mouse anymore. And then situational impairment, I think, is always interesting. So even just thinking about, from a hearing point of view, not having headphones on public transport. Quite often we're still working in the public sector with people who don't have a sound card on their desktop. So, and also from cognitive point of view, it can be stress or anxiety, for example, but it also can be just a simple, noisy and distracting working environment. So the point of that really is to try and get people to think beyond this idea of the accessibility is only for people with permanent impairments. It is beneficial to far more people, and if you can make it accessible to people with permanent impairments, then it does make it universally better for anybody in any situation. So that's quite a useful point. I also look at some different methodologies. So I think this is where I think Katrin, we were talking earlier about maybe the e-learning industry being a little bit sort of behind in the way that it's thinking about accessibility. So two of the methodologies that I just touched on, one is universal design for learning, and that one is very popular, particularly in higher education. And the idea is just, it looks at the individuality of the way that people learn. And one of the things that it does is multiple ways of presenting information. So, you know, that's one of its core principles. And that, in effect, is what we sometimes do when we create accessible e-learning. We look at different ways of presenting the same information depending on what suits the individual. So it's kind of thinking, again, beyond the thinking of just that we're doing this for people with permanent impairments. The other one is inclusive design, which is absolutely fascinating. I really recommend you looking at the Inclusive Design Toolkit by Microsoft. So Microsoft are a really interesting case because for a long time they lagged behind Apple in their commitment to accessibility, but they've really taken it on board now. And you can see that in the products. You can see if you look at the developments in Office 365, for example, that accessibility features much more heavily. And they've got so many fantastic resources. So the toolkit is a really good one. But I think, again, the principle behind inclusive design is just this idea, if I just read that quote, that everyone has abilities and limits to those abilities. So if you design for people with permanent disabilities, it does actually result in designs that benefit people universally. So it's just something that I try and stress, that it's just beyond looking at permanent impairments, really. Just some examples from my own, some of the things that have struck me as I've been designing in the past is this idea that accessible design is good design. So you can see some of the WCAG principles actually benefiting everybody, not necessarily someone with permanent situation or temporary impairments. So, for example, color contrast. If you follow, you know, good color contrast, yes, it helps people who are blind, who've got low vision or colorblind, for example, but it has to be an advantage for everybody to be able to clearly see, because you use good contrast in your text and in your navigation items. So that I think is a good example. Consistent navigation is one that is particularly useful for people who've got cognitive differences, so people who are on the autism spectrum or ADHD, for example. But if you've ever done a piece of e-learning where you didn't have consistent navigation, that cognitive load of trying to find, you know, where do I click next? Where's the exit button gone? You know, where am I going back? It's just obvious that is good design for everybody. Another example, which is a favourite of mine because I am dyslexic myself, so I'm just following the punctuation rule. So that's not actually a WCAG standard, but it is a WCAG recommendation. So capital letters not used for titles or full sentences is, I find it very difficult to read sentences that are in all capital letters. But interestingly, that applies to most people, because the way that we tend to read, I think by the age of 9, we have learnt probably the first 5,000 words that we learn when we're reading. And once we've learnt them, we tend to read them by their shape. So if we are using capital letters, then we're changing the shape of that word, which slows everybody down because it stops you being able to skim read and scan effectively. So although, again, it's a good example of something that can help someone with a cognitive impairment, it does actually benefit everybody to follow that recommendation.
I didn't know that. Yeah, that's interesting. Because in social media, if anyone posts or comments in all capital letters, it's like the yelling thing.
It is the yelling thing, yeah.
And to be fair, I did have problems reading that sentence now in the slides, so that's interesting to know.
Yeah, it's I think it's 13 to 18%. It's supposed to slow people down. So
wow.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's when you were saying, we were talking, I think earlier, about sometimes it's useful to know, you know, WCAG accessibility recommendations, because as I say, it's just good design. So it's something, all capital letters, you see so much, I think, in e-learning resources, and it's just something that actually isn't helping anybody, particularly if they have you know, their cognitive impairment. So it's one of my favourite examples.
Nice.
Then flashing content is another one. So obviously the WCAG reason for avoiding flashing content is because it can cause seizures with people who've got photosensitive epilepsy. But I think, you know, if you've ever looked at a website or a piece of e-learning where you've got something flashing and distracting you, I think avoiding that again is just another example of the fact that accessibility does lead to better design for everybody.
It's interesting that all of these things that everyone thought in the beginning of e-learning would be the interactive things and you know, the most interesting stuff, we now have to shut down because it is distracting, like you said. It's not just for people who might have problems with it, but it's distracting. Don't do it. You want people to learn.
And now there's a good reason to say why.
Exactly.
Why you
Can't
shouldn't
do
have
it.
flashing. Great. Okay, so moving on now to this keyboard accessibility and quiz slide. So that was something that the group asked me to have a look in a bit more detail. And I think probably the reason why is that tends to be the reason why that gives accessible e-learning a bad name, really, the fact that it can't be interactive. So there, obviously, one of the WCAG principles that we were talking about is that everything in your e-learning needs to be keyboard accessible. And so there are automatically things that you're not able to use as a result of that. So if I just move to the next slide, and a good example is hotspots. So people will tend to avoid hotspots. The example I have on the screen actually comes from a piece of software which is called CourseArc, which is an e-learning authoring tool, which is very good on accessibility, and it has native accessibility built in. So if you do use a hotspot interaction in this tool, it automatically generates a transcript for you. So you can, it's not a question of not being able to use a hotspot as long as you make it accessible. So although this tool automatically generates the hotspot transcript, it's something that you could do yourself. You know, it's not difficult to produce. It's a little bit like, it's just an extension of having alt text for an image, really. So so it's definitely possible to make things accessible. It's not a question of thinking, oh no, I can't use that. It's just a question of understanding what you need to do, you know, the options that you need to give people and doing things in a different way. So another example is a drag and drop matching. Again, this comes from CourseArc. And in this example, again, it's automatically generated. So the drag and drop matching is the alternative activity which is generated is just it's a keyboard accessible multiple choice exercise. So this, again, this is a piece of software that does it automatically for you, but there's no reason why you can't generate that yourself. In Storyline, just move to the next slide. There are, in Storyline and in many other authoring tools, they tend to be fairly good on knowing what's accessible and what isn't accessible. I've put together this quiz using Storyline templates just to show you that there are a lot of quiz templates in Storyline which are accessible. So again, it's coming back to this idea of challenging that accessibility can't be interactive. So if I just play this video for you, and I'll explain what's going on as I go through it. So what you can see on the screen is if you're not used to using, let me just pause it for a minute, sorry. If you're not used to seeing this yellow box, it's basically in this particular package, this authoring tool called Storyline, it's very useful for accessibility in the fact that it clearly shows you when you're using the keyboard to navigate through the course. It shows you very clearly using this yellow box where you're actually at on the page. So as you can see, this person, well, it's me actually going through it, but you can see they're literally are using the keyboard, and you can see on this slide that the commands that I'm using to navigate through these slides are the tab, the shift and the tab to move back. So the tab just moves you onto the next object on the slide. Spacebar or enter key is basically is how you select things or activate a button, and the up and down arrow keys are how you select things in a drop down list. So those are standard keys for people who are using a keyboard to navigate. So that's standard for any application, any piece of software that you're using. So as I say, the yellow, let me play this again. So the yellow box is just showing I'm literally using the tab key to navigate through this slide. So you can see that the text entry, this is an example of a text entry quiz slide. So that's perfectly accessible. And you can see then to submit, I'm using the space bar just to activate that. Every time there's a button, I can just use the space bar and it will activate, and the select as well as the space bar. So just some examples of the type of quiz slides that you can use. And as I say, although we're looking specifically at Articulate Storyline, most authoring tools are quite good in telling you which of their interactions and which of their quiz slides are accessible. So just coming back here, I'm using the tab key to move on. I'm using the select key. I'm using the up and down arrows to actually select the option.
Nice.
So I don't know if you've used any of those.
Well, we're trying to actually do a drag and drop.
Uh-huh.
And I think that you had a slide there where they can activate or pick up an item and then they can drop it somewhere.
On this one?
By selecting specific keys, I think. I just saw that on one of the slides, like what in the video.
Okay.
Is that what you do with drag and drop? Because currently what we do is we have a drag and drop, but anyone who can't use a key, so can't use a mouse, then goes into, so there's a separate branch for them to go through, I don't know, 5 or 4 different ones to cover the same information as the drag and drop. And I think what we try to figure out is how to make that specific drag and drop interactive. Yeah.
Okay, so you can, instead of actually using a drag and drop, this is a drag and drop that I've created manually. So I've used I think it's just a pick one slide, and I've put an animation path in it. So basically you can see, if I just carry on playing it in a minute, when you select it,
it goes into the box, doesn't it?
And that's literally just an animation path. Sorry.
Yeah.
The other screen.
I actually did steal that from your website.
That's good. So
that's really nice. I like it. Yeah.
That's literally just using an animation path to create the idea of a drag and drop, really. So
yeah.
But in the example that I showed there, the drag and drop does have, so instead of a matching drag and drop, you have a drop down drag and drop. Sorry, not a drop. Yeah, it's a matching drop down. Yeah, instead of a drag and. It's whether you know, if it's really the drag and drop that you want to do, and is that because, you know, why are you using that? Is it because it's just drag and drop is seen as more interactive, or are you testing them?
So.
Do you know what I mean? You can test you can test that knowledge using a drop down just as well as a drag and drop, really, and that is then accessible.
That's true. Yeah.
So,
is there another way around that? You know, the normal drag and drop, where you basically drag and drop things.
Okay.
Is there a way to make that accessible?
So I would say
I've tried with the animation paths as well, and that was just got way too complicated, and I gave up.
Okay, so I think probably the reason for the animation paths is when you're looking at drag and drops, one of the key things which I didn't understand for a long time, is that people who are using the keyboard could be using it because they have a mobility impairment, so they can't use a mouse. So in that case, they can see the screen. So the idea of putting the animation path in is that it makes it visually interesting for them. So if the idea of using a drag and drop is because it's interactive, I would say that putting an animation path in is just as interesting visually as if you're actually pulling things across and dragging them. But then obviously there are a lot of people who are using keyboard accessible because they've got blind or low vision, and they will be using a screen reader. So I suppose it comes back to, what is your reason for wanting to use the drag and drop?
That's a good point. Yeah, I'm going to have to check with the client, I guess. I think it's a little bit about. I think the drag and drops we used before, they made sense in the way we tested people.
Yeah.
But I think what we were just trying to do, because it is me personally, I think that's just me personally. I like for everyone to have the same offer available.
Yeah.
That makes sense. But I think the one that you showed though with the drop down, that might be another solution that we could offer. Yeah, I really like that.
Yeah, so if you are testing someone, or however, it doesn't have to be testing, just it can be part of the interaction of the actual of the actual module, of the actual resource. I think that it has the same functionality really. It's just doing it in a different way.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I'll move on to another example, and this is an example of using the drag and drop and then giving someone an alternative. I don't know, for the community, I'm not sure everybody will have seen this example, so I think it's just useful. I think for two reasons. One, it shows that it comes back to this idea of sort of universal design for learning, is that it's okay to give other people, I think, an option, a different option. So
that's true. Yeah.
So it's not necessarily, it's just the way that you do it, I think. And I think we talked about this in the past, didn't we? That rather than saying, okay, this is the accessible version. So what we have here is you've got the mouse users or the keyboard users.
Yeah.
Then more of a choice. Sometimes I might want to, I know, for example, I've heard somewhere in the States that keyboard users are called something like super users, or I don't know, I can't remember what the word is, but it just is, people sometimes prefer to use the keyboard because it's quicker for them. So it's not just that you're using it because you've got an impairment. So what I'll show you now is the version that I created, just using so the first one was a drag and drop version, and then the accessible version is using a quiz slide, which is just literally a multiple option and putting in some animation paths. So yes, I agree with you, Katrin, it is a bit fiddly, but I think once, for me, for example, if I ever do a drag and drop now, I have this template. So I can quite easily change that for example, the variables and the triggers, which mean that I can create an accessible drag and drop with animation path if I want to. So I think with any accessibility, I agree with you. To begin with, it is time consuming and it does take a lot of thought. But for everything, if you start thinking differently and you have that template, for example, then in the future you can come back to that. So
copy that, To be fair, it was actually quite fun to create it.
Good.
It was a bit frustrating every now and then, but once you have it, it's actually really nice.
I agree with you, yeah. And this example, no, I completely agree with you, because for me it took quite a long time, and I'll explain why in a minute. But I've just moved the microphone so you can hear this. If you haven't ever, I don't know if you've ever seen or have ever heard a screen reader working with a piece of e-learning.
No.
Okay. No. So if you haven't, this is quite a good sort of it's a good introduction really to a screen reader working. And the screen reader that works with the Storyline software is called JAWS, Job Access for Speech. So it just gives you an example of what someone who's using a screen reader will be hearing as they're going through this quiz. So I'll just play it for you. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it.
Activate, press space bar.
Probably not very clear.
Helping save the planet. We're working to reduce the waste we produce and to recycle as much as we can. This topic will tell you how you can help. Find out more button to activate, press space bar. Helping save the planet. Recycling game. Choose which way to play. Play the game if you use a mouse to navigate, button to activate, press space bar. Play the game if you use a keyboard to navigate, button to activate, press space bar. Space. Recycling at work. Which rubbish should go into the food bin? Use the tab button and space bar to select your options and then select submit to check your answers. Apple Core checkbox not checked. To check, press space bar. Space checked. Onion peel checkbox not checked. The check press space bar. Space checked. Pizza box checkbox not checked. The check. Empty tin checkbox not checked. The check press space bar. Space checked. Space not checked. Use tea bag checkbox not space checked. Submit button to activate. Press space bar. Space. Well done. That's the correct answer.
So hopefully that was just a good introduction to a screen reader and how that works.
Very good. Very good. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it looks good. Very professional.
So is that just helpful to think about? I don't know how it is possible to make drag and drops accessible.
I would say so.
Okay, you still there, Katrin?
Yeah.
We lost Katrin.
I put myself on mute for that. Yeah, of course. And I've kept talking. No, I think that is very helpful. Yeah.
So
one thing that, sorry,
you carry on.
No, I mean, one thing that I really hope they have future developments with the screen readers, because I mean, people might be used to them, but I had a hard time getting used to them when testing the modules.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a different story, I guess.
So you've had hard
just listening to it, because it's quite difficult to understand, I guess, if it's a little bit more text, if that makes sense.
Right.
But it doesn't seem to have proper breaks in between. But then again, it's not a software that we can influence.
No, I agree. And it's very, very interesting if you actually see a screen reader user using one. The speed that they listen to is absolutely phenomenal.
Really?
So, yeah. So with that, the example there is just an example of very basic. That's the standard speed, which is a bit is quite slow. But it's like, if you imagine yourself skim reading, how quickly we can skim read. If you have someone who uses a screen reader all the time, they skim listen.
Yeah, of course, they're used to it. Yeah.
Absolutely phenomenal, the speed that they listen. So, it's just a different skill. It's incredible. So, but hopefully that's given you just some ideas that maybe of how you can use quiz slides accessibly and how you can maybe think about different drag and drops.
Definitely. Thank you.
That's all right. So what I tend to finish on, if we're looking at this idea that accessible design is good design, so that particular the quiz that we were looking at was part of a project that I did at the university when I was at the University of Southampton, and that is an accessible module. And we put it in for the the Learning Technologies Awards, and it was actually shortlisted. So I'm not saying that because I'm just showing off. I just want to kind of prove that it is possible to make accessibility just as interactive, just as engaging as something that isn't accessible. If it can be shortlisted for a national award, then there must be something that shows that it can be as good, if not better, than a piece of learning that isn't accessible. And it comes back
well done. Yeah,
amazing. Yeah.
So this comes back to a quote that I really like, which is that diversity is the engine of invention, which generates creativity that enriches the world. So for me, I think, as you were saying, Katrin, it's the fact that actually working and thinking about things accessibly makes you a better designer, makes you a better developer, because you're trying to really think about the needs of all of your learners, and it just makes you think in a different way. It makes you have to think creatively. I know sometimes it is stressful if you've got time limits, etc., but if you are able to, I think it can really help you develop as a designer and a developer, in my experience. Okay, accessible VR. This was again something that the community asked me to have a look at. So it wasn't something that I have got a great deal of experience at. So it was really useful for me to have a look at it at VR and AR from an accessibility point of view. So I think for everybody, the idea that making something accessible, making VR, which is such a visual you know, such a visual medium, making that accessible just seems very difficult to, you just think, well, I just can't even begin to imagine how that's possible. So
Yeah.
I just looked for some examples. And again, coming back to Microsoft, they have a research team who are developing a Seeing VR toolkit. And again, just looking, this came from an article which I'll send you the link to, but just looking at some of the options that they are trying to come up with, it helps you to think, actually, yes, I can understand how that can be possible. So for example, they've got the one group which is just overlaying accessibility on the application. So things like a magnification lens or text to speech, for example. And then on the other side, you've got an actual toolkit, which it has usability enhancements actually in the software. So, and for me, the one that really was interesting was using it with assistive apps. So for example, you know, apps that are used all the time by people who've got visual impairments like Seeing AI and BizWiz, they can be used in that VR, you know, for VR as well. So Seeing AI is verbally describing the scene, which makes sense. BizWiz sending a screen capture along with the user's question to a human who provides a response in real time. So for me, that was really interesting. Just again, it's this idea of thinking things in a different way and thinking, actually, you know, our perception is it's not possible, but it is if you think of things in a different way. And another example, again for vision, is the cane troller that I think I shared on the group. And again, this probably it's difficult to explain what it does unless you look. So I've got a little clip of what that does. So it's thinking about orientation and mobility skills, but look at doing it into a VR environment. So I'll just play this for you.
Virtual reality experiences today rely primarily on visual channels to create an immersive experience, which makes them inaccessible for people with visual impairments. We created a novel VR experience by using haptic and audio feedback to enable people with visual impairments to experience the virtual world. Our novel haptic controller simulates the interaction of a white cane to help people who are blind understand and navigate a virtual space using their existing orientation and mobility skills. This haptic controller is paired with an HTC Vive headset used for tracking the user's head position and for delivering 3D spatial audio through headphones. No visual feedback is rendered in front of the user's eyes.
Oh, that's really cool.
It's good, isn't it?
Never would have thought of that.
No, me neither. So that the video goes on to show that so they've got two environments. One is inside and one is outside. And the one outside, it shows how they're using it to initially train people to, you know, the bumps on the road when there's a crossing.
Yeah.
It shows them how to safely navigate, you know, using they learn how to use the bumps to know where they need to cross the road and find the the crossing. So yeah, so nice. Really interesting. So those two are based on vision. I was looking for something that maybe was addressing all of the type of impairments, and I found a project which is being run at the BBC. And they are looking at all, as well as vision, they're also looking at the other three types of impairments. So this was interesting because the examples they gave, you can see in the picture here. The one example is that they have a switch accessible controller. So someone with a cognitive impairment can use VR. And what happens in this switch controller is one of the circles, if you hit one of the circles, it brings up a teleporter, and then if you release it, it teleports you to the end of the beam. So it's just showing again different ways that can be achieved. And the other example they gave, which was really interesting, was looking at VR from someone who has a cognitive impairment. So the example they gave was someone who is on the autism spectrum, and they realized that it's really important to be very clear about your instructions and the order that you give instructions, because in their example, the person that was doing the testing for them, who was severely autistic, they said they put the headset on first and then gave them the controller to hold. They said that in the environment there was nothing that could harm them, that it wasn't real, but as soon as the person picked up the controller, it started floating towards them, because it actually appeared in the environment. So, you know, really disconcerting and really upset this person.
Yeah.
So it's just those types of things that they're testing for at the moment. So that's really early on in its you know, its infancy, that project, but I think it's really interesting. So I think it just shows that it's possible. It's just a different mindset, really, thinking about things in a different way.
Definitely. That's awesome. Yeah. Thanks for looking into that.
No worries. Any questions or anything? Any comments?
Not to know. I think that's no.
Lovely. Okay. We'll just
Great overview.
Great. Okay. Just moving on to our
just
oh, yeah. No worries. Yeah.
Just a second. You send us the slides with some of those details.
Yeah. So that's all on the information that I sent you. It's got all of the links and the details.
Yes. Yeah, because I missed with the Microsoft. I wanted to just follow up on that.
Okay, that's fine. Yes.
Project.
Yes, so definitely we'll do that. Yeah, we'll send you out all the information. Okay, so moving on to the more benefits of accessibility. So this is the section where I do my training, and also, you know, any information that I give on accessibility is trying to, hopefully, maybe what you've seen will have made you think that accessibility is something that is worth pursuing. Sometimes I found in the past that even if you, as whichever role you're in, sometimes it's difficult to get other people on board when it comes to accessibility. So it's really looking at some of the advantages of accessibility from more of a business point of view, and more of a, you know, what's in it for me really for following accessibility. And some of it is also looking at some statistics about permanent disability, which I think it does bring home how important it is really. So we'll do this very quickly. So just for example, in the UK, out of a population of 66 million people, 13.9 million have a disability. So this idea of 20% of people generally have some kind of disability, and that can be higher in some countries. For example, in the US, it's actually, rather than 1 in 4, it's 1 in 5 in the US have, sorry, rather than 1 in 5 in the US, it's 1 in 4 have a disability. So, you know, that percentage of people who have a permanent disability is certainly something that I was really surprised about when I first found out about it. And I think one of the reasons is that people tend to think of disability just as a visual disability. So they think of disability more of, you know, the mobility, someone in a wheelchair, or maybe someone with a visual impairment. They don't, I think when you think again about the different types of impairments, then I think it becomes much clearer why there are so many people who do have a disability. And it also makes it easier to understand this idea that we are all only temporarily able-bodied, which I think is a really interesting concept, particularly with the aging population. Obviously, as the older we get, the more likely we are ourselves to develop a disability. So yeah, I think that's just something that is really worth considering. And these are statistics that I also tend to use sometimes just to bring home, you know, how many people do have, you know, impairments or will have them. So 1 in 5 will have a sight loss in their lifetime, 1 in 6 has hearing loss, 1 in 12 men are colourblind. So those, sometimes you have people saying, oh, well, you know, we check for, you know, if we have anyone colourblind, then I've heard that before, we just, you know, we check to make sure that we've got someone, if we've got someone who's colourblind. Well, 1 in 12 men are colourblind, so, you know, that's something to be aware of. And the same, 1 in 10 people has some degree of dyslexia, which, as I said, that applies to me. So, you know, it's, how do you know when you're looking at learner engagement? You don't want to, if you want to engage as many people as possible, then if your learning isn't accessible, then you're automatically excluding any people who've got a permanent impairment. So, and that's a significant proportion. I think if you think of 20% of the people. Then we move on to workplace learning, because again, that's another perception that people have, is that there isn't much disability in the workplace. So I've heard, you know, people say, oh, we don't have anyone in our department or in our faculty, for example, or in our team that's got a disability, so it doesn't apply to us. But again, part of that perception is because 80% of disabled people have a hidden impairment. So you're not aware of all of the impairments that are there. When you look at cognitive impairment and you think that includes mental health issues, I think it just becomes much more understandable why it's so significant, why there are, you know, even in the workplace, if we look at the figures, is actually 11% of the workforce have got a permanent disability. So from a workplace learning point of view, if you think, even if you think, you know, just for a minute about some of the things that we tend to cover on workplace learning, you've got the things like policy and compliance, health and safety, induction and onboarding, or staff development. So much of that is delivered online and virtually that, you know, if you don't make things accessible, your 11% of your workforce will be excluded from that learning, which I think is a significant proportion. Okay, looking just to finish, a couple of reasons why accessibility is also good for business and good for your career as well. So from a business point of view, useful if you are trying to persuade management of the reason for accessibility is the fact that it's a huge market. So I think the disability market used to be considered to be a niche market, which is where you get this this quote coming from. The 1.3 billion people in the world with disabilities is not a niche; it's a demographic megatrend, which I really I really like that quote. But if you think about how much that market is worth in the UK, that's worth £249 billion. That was called the purple pound market, the disability market. And globally, that's worth £8 trillion. So it's just a sector that, you know, a market that people to ignore it just doesn't make sense. And you do see there's lots of movements now which are looking at including disability more in the workplace. So yes, because of the fact that it is good for business. And finally, good for your career. So this is an example of an advert that I found just on a site called Upwork. And it's only one advert, I admit, but I think it just shows, this is taken from the States, and I think it's a demonstration that, you know, if you are in the e-learning sector, if you develop your accessibility knowledge and your skills, it is I think, Catherine, you said when we were talking that it's something that's not going away. I think it definitely will become much more important. And I think if you, for example, as you can see in this advert, if you know how to apply the web content accessibility guidelines and you understand accessibility, I think it will be a much sought after you know, a skill in the future moving forward. So it will, I think it will future-proof your career if you can invest time and into finding out how to make things accessible.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think that is the end of me talking and talking and talking. So I don't know if you have any more questions.
Not from my side, Tony.
Susie, no, I thought that was really, really informative.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I really, yeah, that's absolutely great.
Brilliant. Okay, that's very kind of you.
Yes, so looking forward to more of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just okay. Well,
No
we'll follow up.
Okay, I'll stop the sharing then.
All right. Yeah.
And then I'll stop the recording as long as you haven't got any questions.
All good from my side. Thank you